welcome to the session that I have been instructed on, in no uncertain terms, not to call Democracy in the Dock, the Promise of Democracy, Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. We had, quite a tour de force in our keynote speech just now. I hope everyone is suitably terrified and depressed. We are going to attempt to take that a step further. If we started off with the global, we're now going to drill down into the local, into the nitty-gritty of this subject with an incredible panel of 4 speakers. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce them right now. Moving from right to left, my stage right to left, geographically, not politically. Or maybe politically, I don't know what I'm going to say. I've seen Danny's Twitter, I'd be very surprised. I have, to my immediate left, Daniel Trilling, who is a journalist and author, and I haven't confessed this to him, but I sort of both love and hate his work, because a couple of years ago, I wrote an essay in Prospect I was really proud of about how the establishment has sort of normalised far-right discourses, and I thought I'd come up with something really brilliant. And then I saw Daniel's book, which is called If We Tolerate This, How the British Establishment Made the Far-Right Respectable. And I realised not only had he got to my point way before me, but he'd done it so much better than I had. It's a truly brilliant book. I recommend it, and I'm really looking forward to what Daniel has to say today. Moving across, we have Clair Ainsley, who is the director of the Centre Left Renewal Project at the Progressive Policy Institute. She has really interesting perspective here because she works for a US think tank, but is based in York. And I've been reading recently her work on Bidenomics, which I, along with a lot of other people, sort of saw as a silver bullet for defeating the far right, and very clearly wasn't. And Claire's work on why that might be and what lessons we can learn from that is incredibly insightful and important. Moving left, Professor Paul Cartledge, who is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow at Clair College, Cambridge, and Emeritus Professor of Greek Culture. He is the author of so many books. If I were to start listing them, we would still be here next Christmas. But I do want to just mention his book, Democracy, A Life, which was an education for me. I would put that as a sort of cornerstone of my education. I'm sure many other people would say the same. But that is not the best bit about Paul. I've chaired a few of these events. I always get to introduce very impressive people, but no one quite has this accolade, which is that Paul is an honorary citizen of Sparta, which I think is the best accolade I've ever.
Watch out, all of you. Right.
And last but most certainly not least, we have Danny Dorling. Danny is again amazing. I'm sure many of us of my generation grew up reading him in The Guardian and in The New Statesman. He is the Halford Mackenzie Professor of Geography at Oxford. His latest book, The Next Crisis, What We Think About Our Future, is both out now and terrifying. But I have been reading Danny forever and ever, and there are a few more insightful voices looking beyond the sort of headlines and looking at some real structural issues about the causes of various political changes. I'm incredibly excited to hear what all of these fantastic speakers have to say. However, I'm not going to give them very long to say it. Each has 7 minutes, after which we will devise a suitable punishment for anyone who speaks for too long. I'm going to invite them to each speak for 7 minutes, then abuse my privileges as chair to ask them a couple of questions before opening up the floor to you. And when we do that, I'll also invite Dex to come and join the panel. I've got a special chair there for him, so that you'll get an extra opportunity to ask him some questions as well. Without further ado, Daniel, please kick us off.
Alright, thanks very much, Sam. Thanks everyone for coming. So, in a way, I'm going to pick up on some of those themes that Dex introduced us to earlier, but go very, very local and very, very current with them. So I'm a journalist, and as a journalist, I do a lot of reporting and analysis on nationalism, migration, and human rights. All of which are very pressing political issues here in the UK right now and internationally. But my most recent work, as we just heard, has been about how British politics has reached this current moment. And so, for me, what I find very striking is that when I began as a journalist, I used to work at the News Statesman many years ago, and in around 2009 I was reading about the BNP, British National Party, and how they've been winning seats in local government around the country, and so I went and reported on that and on sort of the political failures that were allowing that to happen. And what I'm struck about today is just how much of what the BNP was saying then, in 2009 and 2010, and at the time was regarded as shocking, outrageous, alarming and so on, is now right there in mainstream political discourse. And so what I thought I'd do for the next 5 minutes is just make a couple of comments on the broad phenomenon of parties and movements like Reform UK, Restore Britain, Tommy Robinson and so on, what I think is actually going on there, and what that tells us about democracy. And so I describe all of those phenomena and their cousins, in Europe, in North America and elsewhere in the world, as the far right. And I think I should just explain to you what I mean by that first of all. I think quite often when we hear that term far right, it immediately conjures up the image of fascists and Nazis, and that therefore the threat coming from the far right is something very similar to what happened in the 1920s and 30s Europe, where you will have these militarised political movements centred around the cult of leadership that intimidate their opponents and then, when they gain power, immediately abolish democracy. And certainly that's part of what the far right means, but it's not the entirety. And I think if we cleave too heavily to that historical comparison, we miss what's going on at the moment, what's kind of new and specific about our current moment. And so the best framework I found for understanding this comes from a political scientist called Cas Mudde, who is he's Dutch and now based in the US. He's one of the world's leading experts on far-right politics. He defines the far right as, in quite simple terms, a collection of radical right-wing nationalist movements that sit outside the traditional mainstream of politics. But within that, he divides it into two wings. So one wing, Mudde terms the extreme right, and that would be groups, as he puts it, that are hostile to the essence of democracy. So those sort of traditional fascists would fit right into that category, because fascism essentially seeks to abolish democracy and replace it with dictatorship. But the other wing, and I think the more important one for us at the moment, given the current mix of politics in the UK and many other countries, is what Mudde and lots of other political scientists call the radical right. So that would be groups, movements and parties that accept the essence of democracy. They might well be very enthusiastic about elections. They might well abide by results of elections when they don't lose, although that isn't always guaranteed, as we can see in various places, not least the US. But they are uniformly hostile to key elements of liberal democracy as a political system, because that's the actually existing system we live under. And what you will find across the board from radical right parties, so right-wing populist is a kind of term that's used interchangeably with that more technical term, radical right, that they are both rhetorically and practically hostile to some of the very important checks and balances that prevent modern mass democracy from becoming either corrupted or from being a simple tyranny of the majority. So the frequency with which the radical right, far-right populists attack, for example, the independence of the judiciary, or the idea of a free media that is free to scrutinise and criticise people in power. Think of the fact that for today's far-right, quote-unquote, free speech is their big rallying cry. And now think about any example of where a right-wing populist government has taken power in the world, and think, has free speech actually got more free there? The answer everywhere, I think, is no, and in almost every case, you can point to ways in which they have actually restricted political expression, not least by, for example, going after media outlets that displease them. And so for that reason, I think it's important to think of all of these different movements as part of the far right, and to see that they all pose a threat in different ways to our freedom and to the working of democratic systems. And I think the thing that underlies all of that, and what makes it potentially much more dangerous than, say, a silver-tongued Nigel Farage politician might make it sound, is the fact that what all of these groups and movements do uniformly as well is they appeal very heavily to negative, resentful, and potentially very destructive emotions, which the crudest way I can put it is that really all they have to talk about is sex, birth and death, and evoking threats, perceived threats to the nation on those terms. You know, these are ideas that are intended to evoke this visceral sense of threat. So, as you've probably been following over the past week, there have been these horrendous reactions and attempts to exploit the murder of Henry Novak, and I think that's exactly what I talk about. You know, Nigel Farage, for instance, he's basically been in hiding since the local elections because he's been faced with a barrage of negative stories. You know, that was £5 million donation. Before that, there were all the many allegations from former classmates about his school days racism and so on. Reform actually didn't do as well as they'd hyped up people's expectations in the local elections. And then the moment he comes out, it's when he can hit at exactly what I'm talking about. You know, a murder that allows him to make a claim of anti-white racism that ties together several far-right populist themes into one thing. You know, the supposed dangerous threat posed by people of immigrant backgrounds and quote-unquote woke elite that has betrayed the nation and so on. That is always there in this type of politics, and it is potentially very, very dangerous. It is a destructive set of emotions they are mobilising. Now, just finally, for 30 seconds to a minute, if I can, I'll just give my quick thoughts on what I think that means for democracy more generally. I think two things that I would say about that. One is that, although, well, certainly I do, we might well deplore that kind of politics and want to oppose it, we have to see that it arises from some fundamental contradictions in the way that we have democracy in our time. And I think the key contradiction for me is that under liberal democracy, you have this formal promise of equality, you know, equality before the law, equality in terms of background, class, social, economic, ethnic, and so on. But we have an economic system, capitalism, that is inherently unequal, that we all occupy different positions within a hierarchy. And the way that that has traditionally been resolved, those two things, is to say, well, that's true, but politicians will give you continually improving living standards. And as we have in Dex, that hasn't been happening for quite a long time, certainly for large groups of people in Britain, for instance. And I think far-right politics emerges from that gap, emerges from the resentments that grow out of that gap. And so this brings me on to my second point, which is that I think over the past decade, as far-right populism has emerged and become a major current in our time, there has been a reaction, particularly from the political centre, that this is just something we should suppress. You know, we just need to put it back in its box. And in fact, actually, I think what we need to do is recognise the failings from which it springs, and that our response needs to be based on an attitude of more democracy, not less. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gavin. Claire, take us away.
Well, that is nicely done, because that was the first structural failure that I was going to highlight. So we've done that without planning it. So when thinking about the kind of structural failures we've got in liberal democracy, it's quite a long charge sheet. So I was going to focus on three that I wanted to highlight. And the first is exactly as Ben suggested, on this sort of promise of political equality that isn't then borne out in practice, and it has given us, in each of our democracies, a different, sense of political inequality. But I think in our democracy, you can really feel it when it comes to kind of class, geography, in lots and lots of different ways. And I think that partly because of the research that I've done previously, not least with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is here as a supporter of the festival. But also I then had the experience of going into politics. So when Keir Starmer was elected leading the Labour Party, I left JRF then to become his Director of Policy for the first 2.5 years, and with all good intentions really about what it was we were trying to do, which was to really increase the political power as Michael is for today's working class voters. But what I found there was kind of worse than I expected, and I went into no expectation in terms of the kind of preoccupations of Westminster. And that was, I would say, a group of people who I felt pretty sympathetic to, and in lots of ways still do, in terms of their intent. But the kind of theatre of Westminster and the incentives and drivers on, I would say, some well-intentioned people really took us away from what Dex was talking about, and really our preoccupations ought to have been what that future world looks like and how we can use public policy to steer it in a direction that is going to benefit the citizens that have elected us and that we govern for. So it's that political inequality of power, I think, is kind of the first charge. I think the second related to that is I think governments over time have conceded so much ground to lots of different forces, lots of globalised forces, market forces. So it just means that a lot of the things that are affecting us as citizens in our lives, politicians can say to us, we're going to do this, we're going to do this policy over here, and actually the things that matter to us as citizens are things that actually governments either are unwilling to do, can't do, or requires engagement for a number of actors who are outside that kind of democratic control. So we are, as Dex said, we are leaving it too late, but it means that governments are incredibly slow to respond. So what we've got is legislation in Parliament that feels like it's going to be outdated by the time it's even got out the other end. Meanwhile, the world is moving at such a pace that the kind of design of policy is lagging well behind. And it means that even if you have good intent, you are structurally at a disadvantage trying to get ahead of that policy. So no wonder, therefore, coming to my third point, people see that deficit and they experience it, and they just are exasperated really with governments of all kind of political parties and not really representing them. And I did some work for KPR, where I now work, looking at US, UK, Germany, Australia, and really disaffection with people who previously voted for centre-left parties in each of their iterations, but just a complete disenchantment that not just that the party didn't represent them anymore, but that government even had the capability or capacity or competence, because this disconnect they're experiencing of a life that is going very, very fast, that is on our phones, that is in our homes. It's about the prices that they pay at the petrol pump. Politicians saying things that almost they know themselves they cannot deliver that change. And it's that gap between what people are experiencing in their lives, what politicians are saying, that I think is really leading to this breakdown. And that is an environment that I think a dangerous politics is breeding in, and people are either going to not voting or feeling really disenchanted, or I think it's opening them up to authoritarianism. And I think when we think about young people in particular, we have to be focused on the fact that so many young people feel that really, really acutely, I think for lots of very good material reasons. Open Society did an international survey of 30 countries, so this is not just a problem we have here or can solve here. And amongst 18 to 35-year-olds, 42% said military rule was acceptable, and only 57% of that group said democracy was preferable to other forms of rule. And when you looked at the groups of 56 and over, 71% of them favoured liberal democracy. So we have a real issue that is that young people, I think, are much, much more acutely aware of, and that they are turning potentially to other solutions. So we've got this real collapse in trust, I think it's about, and that's before we get into the world that Dex introduced us to. So my charge sheet is kind of pre-Dex, then you've got a Texas layer over it. So we are in a risky place. But democracy is worth saving. I think that you might hear lots today of the criticisms that I and others have got of liberal democracy, but it is worth saving. And if you want to know why, just ask people who live under authoritarian or totalitarian regimes and ask them about what they might prefer. And I think we are not kind of, in the rejection of liberal democracy, we are not moving to some kind of utopia where we are more equal as people. We are moving to more concentrations of power. So I think we have to really fight for democracy. So before I finish up, I want to just give us sort of 3 things I'd like our juries to think about later on when you come to assess whether to put democracy in the dock or maybe give it a second chance. And we do believe in reformative justice, I'm sure, and redemption. So I think we have to think about how it can be rehabilitated to serve the world as it is and is going to be. I think the first thing we can do is we have to be clear about what we want citizen control over. So where you want a democratic link between what matters in our lives and what is actually affecting us day to day. I don't think that necessarily means the state takes over those things, but I think we have to think about where we need to have more democratic control. So where we might have that line, might it be into the tech operations, might it be where we've got volatile prices and we've got supply lines. So it might be thinking more in terms of national sovereignty where you can have democratic links, and I think some of that does require partnership. The second area I think we should think about is democratic reform. I think on its own it's not going to solve the problems I think are rooted in the type of economic system we have, but I do think greater devolution, I think greater citizen participation, I think having our regions having more of a representation at the centre, these are all things that would help. Like none of them on their own, but I think they're things that are going to help. And about how you bring some of those that have got that power into the democratic system. I think lastly, we have to rethink citizenship for ourselves, like thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen in a democracy? What do we expect? What do we do too? This afternoon, the people who are going to be asked to be part of the jury, might that be something that we could consider building into our democracy so it makes it more representative of how we are, but also how we bring people into the design of policy so we can make it more faster flowing in a way that you might, if you were building a new product, you would build it with design capability in it. We can't wait for legislation at the end. And then lastly, how we educate ourselves for inclusive citizenship and our identities, that we don't take for granted our freedoms, but we expect more, and we expect active citizens, not passivity.
And now for something completely different. I am not an activist. I am in a way, but I'm not officially an activist. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a policy wonk. I am a historian. And so, because I normally speak without notes and with slides, I know that speaking extempore takes longer than reading a text. So with apologies, I'm going to read a text, and I hope to stop within, Sam will tell me, 7 minutes. So, some years back, Sarah Mitchell, but for whom none of us would be here, was kind enough to invite me to an earlier democracy panel at this very festival. The theme then was democracy under attack, under threat, in crisis. And through my participation then, I was lucky enough, among other things, to meet first campaigning journalist David Patrikarakos. I was, of course, very attracted to him because of his last name, which is Greek, but actually his heritage is even more interesting than Southern Greek. Democracy, our democracy, much of global, mainly Western, but including Southeast Asian and Australasian and Latin American and African democracy, is still in crisis. If anything, it's in deeper crisis. It's also on trial, possibly for its life. Well, I felt then, when I last participated, as I do now, a little bit of an interloper. Although the word democracy is ultimately of ancient Greek derivation, it means people power, but what does people mean? And although I'm a historian of ancient Greece, and as Sam says, I've written a book on democracy, ancient and modern, I'm very well aware that knowing the history of the word doesn't help us much towards examining why what we now call democracy is on trial, or towards recommending ways in which it can best survive its current, possibly existentialist trials. One fundamental reason for that is essential categorical difference. All ancient Greek democracies and all versions of democracy practiced in antiquity were to us desperately foreign, irreducibly alien to any modern or contemporary version in one key respect. Their democracies were direct, ours are representative. They, the people, ruled for themselves, whereas we choose, usually by election, those who will rule for us. Now, we hope they will do so in our best interests, but they also rule instead of us. That very process separates out a political class, or at any rate removes them from our direct everyday control. Is that lack of accountability one source of our current trial or trials? There's a second fundamental difference. We today argue about what is the most democratic way to hold elections. But we don't argue, or we don't argue much, over whether the best way of choosing our representatives is indeed via election, as opposed to, say, sortition, the use of the lot, which is what ancient Greeks considered to be the democratic mode. They thought that because the lottery is random and blind, it maximises the chance of any one individual's getting chosen, and it encourages more of the eligible to put their names forward, because there's less stigma, less disgrace in not being chosen by random lot than in not being elected in a public ballot. Now, I can think of several areas of our democratic governance to which some application of lottery would likely be beneficial. Yes, House of Lords, I'm thinking of you. Ancient Greek democrats also argued that election too much favoured the rich, the powerful, and the well-known citizens, the notables, at the expense of everyday ordinary people, with two systematic exceptions: offices that demanded special skills or deep pockets, they should be elected. Is that another source of our current crisis? Not only not enough sortition, but the wrong sort of people putting themselves forward for election. Well, those are the two fundamental distinctions between all ancient and all modern democracies. But what is the basic distinction among contemporary democracies? One that often seems to me to be overlooked. I mean the distinction between presidential democracies and parliamentary democracies. The French system, just across the channel, is a presidential one, the weaknesses or even dangers of which either have been already exposed since the present system was set up by de Gaulle back in the 50s, or they threaten to be as we live in the shadow of a possible Marine Le Pen presidency. But of course the true potential horrors of a presidential system have been exposed and actuated across the water the other way in the United States of America. A system supposedly designed to encapsulate checks and balances, not least as between the presidency and the elected Congress, but also in terms of the separation of the powers of government as between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. Trump has trashed both of those. That notion, checks and balances, has its origin ultimately in history of ancient Greek historian Polybius, but not Greek history, Roman history. He was writing about the High Roman Republic, and his writing so influenced the founding fathers. Now, of course, the US Constitution was weighted and loaded from the start away from mass democracy and towards oligarchy via the Electoral College and the Supreme Court. But that inclination has never been more cruelly exposed and exploited than it is being now by the tangerine tyrant occupying what's left of the White House. Ancient Greek democrats had no knowledge of the idea or practice of the separation of powers. And they wouldn't have wanted to. For them, the people should rule, the people themselves, in every sphere, on one condition, that all office holders, from the highest to the most humble, whether selected by lot, as most were, or elected, should constantly be accountable to the people and in law. Now, our session is entitled Democracy on Trial. As it happens, an American colleague, a very good friend of mine, Jenny Roberts, American, published in 1994 a superb monograph entitled Athens, that is, Democratic Athens, on Trial. The sting is in the subtitle, and this, I think, usually comes as a surprise to most people when they first know that the anti-democratic tradition in Western thought, from antiquity on, has always been far the stronger, right down to, well, the cracks started perhaps in the middle of the 19th century, when democracy started to rise up a little bit in the spectrum, but representative democracy, not ancient. So in antiquity, most intellectuals, such as myself, would have been, as it were, on the right. They thought democracy was a thoroughly bad thing. The masses were ignorant, they were stupid, they were ill-educated. Why on earth should they collectively, simply because there were more of them, rule over the elite like me, the smart, the well-educated, the well-born, the knowledgeable, you know what I'm saying. So democracy itself is a problematic concept from its very origin. And that's one reason, I think, why we today, who defend our version of democracy, liberal democracy, are in trouble, because it has inherent potential structural weaknesses. And Danny mentioned one of them, tyranny of the majority. That was one of the typical charges levelled against democracy. It got it wrong. The masses ruled stupidly in their own interests, not the best interests of the state. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much if you have been listening.
Thank you, Paul. And last but certainly not least, Danny.
Thank you. I'm a geographer, so I'm going to try not to do much history, but just a little bit. I was reminded when you were talking then about Plato and his gold and silver and bronze children. Or was it iron children? The idea... Bronze and silver children. That some people, presumably... And it's always... People who say these things always think that they're the golden children themselves. And no doubt the tech billionaires think that they're golden children. And you can read it in some of their writings. Some of the more extreme of the billionaires actually spill out their thoughts about how the mass of people, particularly women, by the way, are really undeserving of having any power. So this has been with human beings for millennia, this idea that a few people are very clever and most people are not. I covered democracies are recent. We got them because there was a fear amongst the elite of something else occurring. They didn't just extend the franchise to more working men and then to other people out of the goodness of their hearts or because they were convinced about an argument. They extended the franchises to voting because they saw what was happening when you didn't do that. There was a fear that people will take over otherwise. But it's a relatively recent, it's, 2 or 3 or 4 generations of humans have lived through this. Some optimism to begin my 7 minutes. As far as I'm aware, the proportion of people living under democracy in the world is not falling. If anything, it has been slightly rising. There are more elections are observed more. On balance, they're slightly fairer than they were in the past worldwide. Our problem is we're sitting in the UK, which is a very strange country, and the country we look to most for kind of intellectual leadership is the USA. And this can give us a very jaundiced view of what's going on in the world when we look at ourselves and when we look at the USA. Good news about democracy. Hungary. And it's amazing how quickly something dramatic can happen, like the Hungarian elections. And within 24 hours we go, oh, that happened. There isn't a continued celebration of an enormous turnout. Was it 80%? A huge turnout from the young. Majority of people in Hungary voting for parties that they didn't believe in, for a change they did believe in. Unpredicted, and it occurred. Or Poland. Last election in Poland, or Spain, or Golden Dawn, if you remember them, dying out in Greece. All the good news stories about democracies are quickly subsumed by a bad news story of where has the right or the far right won most recently. And I think that is dangerous because it can make us think that we're doomed because of this attention of the rise of one side rather than where it fails or where it constantly fails. People around the world who have not voted in the equivalents of Donald Trump after seeing what Donald Trump does in their country. Think about Brazil and the last election there. So if you can take yourself away from the UK, it isn't that bad a story. However, we're stuck here. And it's not just a feeling that this is bad. The Office of National Statistics undertakes a survey around about April each year of about 4,000 people. It's only done it in a particular form for about 3 or 4 years, where it asks them what they think about the fairness of elections in the country, the fairness of the institutions, the corruption and so on, and also their social media use. Now, in the most recent survey, which was undertaken from the 1st to the 26th of April this year, only 51% of people surveyed thought that our elections were fair. The drop was the fastest drop in the history of this survey, in just 12 months. If that drop were to carry on, you very rapidly get a situation where the large majority of the population don't believe our elections are fair. What about the social media use? Is it people who use social media who think that elections are bad? No. It's just a 4% increase amongst those who used it more as opposed to those who used it less. And by age, again, only a small difference. This is universal, both sexes, all ages, increased disenchantment. People were worried about biases in the media. Of course, one person's bias is another person's truth. But in general, more and more, something like 73% of people said one of the main problems was bias in the media. But the third biggest fear of people was overseas interventions in our politics. Now, this to me actually suggests quite a lot of optimism about our electorate. That if you survey 4,000 people, you find a third of them are aware of the overseas interventions in our politics. Why we allow those overseas interventions is another question. We are a strange country. We tend to look at other countries and say that they have problems like us, but it isn't true. Our Conservative Party left the European People's Party, the collection of European Conservative parties, in 2014, and moved to join an alliance with Alternative for Deutschland. Our Conservative Party became a far-right party then, with far-right being defined as, here's your European politics, here's the largest group, this is my right, your left, let's try and be clever. Here's the largest group in Europe, which are Conservatives, and our Conservative Party went off to a small group, the far-right. Reform are far right. They object if the BBC calls them far-right. Right? The Store are far right. But as our politics has moved to the right, we've adjusted our thinking to see these things as kind of reasonable, and they're not reasonable historically, and they're not reasonable geographically. I'll end by talking about the relationship between inequality and democracy. Inequality is not good for democracy. On average, the more equality, economic equality you have in a country, the more people take part in voting. The fairer voting system you have, because one thing I'm sure will come up in questions, we barely have a democracy at the moment. Our Westminster voting system is archaic, and it's always interesting to look back and work out why didn't we adopt one of the systems that most of the rest of Europe did for electing people rather than what we currently have. Our House of Lords is particularly weird, and of course we're the only other country apart from Iran that has clerics in our legislature. Inequality is linked to this. It's not just that people are more engaged when we're more equal, but when we're very unequal, wealth amasses amongst a certain group. It lasted in the 1920s and 1930s, mostly had money, right? You can't always compare the 30s to the past, but the far right had money and were trying to protect a particular position. The two countries which we have data for in the world with the biggest rises in economic inequality in the 1930s were Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan had the biggest rises in income inequality in the 1930s. It's not deterministic, but you shouldn't ignore this. And in all of Europe, we have had the biggest rise in economic inequality in recent years, and now we have this utterly fractured politics. I don't think that you should vote to say that democracy has failed because it's a universal concept, but I think you could say that it's failed in the UK, and if that young man standing in Makerfield were to win his election, I think he should actually firmly say that he'll want to change the electoral system. I think that's the kind of hope you need to give people. There are other things you can do, but it is worth saying we weren't going to go away from first past the post. Because if we stick with first past the post at the moment, as it is, what happens is very, very unpredictable, and quite easily a minority of voters with a lot of money coming in from abroad can end up electing a government who may well not want there to be elections in quite the same way in future. So democracy is under threat in this country, but democracies worldwide generally are doing okay. I was going to talk about China, but I'll say a little, but it's worth not being arrogant about China. If you had a choice now, most of you are at the right age of this, to imagine that you weren't born here, most of you are born here, but you're going to be born at random, back in your birth date, in India or China, and be a random citizen, which country would you choose to have been born in? I'll just leave that with you as a thought experiment. Simply saying that this is the best system for all time is a bit silly, given that we've only had it in its current form for a few generations, and we only got it because the elite were scared that their power would be taken away. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to kick off by picking up on something that all of you sort of mentioned at one point, which was to qualify democracy in its current form with the word liberal. And the first time I sort of noticed people doing that was actually Viktor Orban, who was eulogising this idea of illiberal democracy. And I feel like the qualification liberal to democracy has sort of entered the Western lexicon around the same time. My question is, and of course I suspect Paul will have a rather different view on this, can you have genuine democracy that is not liberal democracy? And by that I mean, can you have genuine democracy where the fundamental rights of the individual are not protected, and a democracy that is not built on the basis of individuals having fundamental and inviolable rights?
If I could just come in. The ancient Greeks did not have a notion of the individual. There's no ancient Greek word for the individual. If you go to Greece today, the word is atomos, which means something that's not cut, uncuttable, atom, individual. Whereas, of course, in our discourse, going back to Locke, 17th century, 18th century, we think of the individual as somehow inviolable, some sort of barrier around that the state, another concept the ancient Greeks didn't have, because they were the state. The citizens were the state. So my perspective is simply difference, that I value the way in which the world has changed. Since the 17th century, I'm a great supporter of the Levellers, as it happens. I was brought up in Putney debates, but I recognise that the big distinction is really late 19th, early 20th, when we moved to universal adult suffrage, so women as well as men. And that's the big, to me, advance in terms of entitlement. And what was being said on my left is, of course, rather more critical than that might just reacting to the why are we talking about liberal democracy? We are talking about it because it's the way our democracy has developed, and it's not necessarily to be applied anywhere else. I will just add one other thing. We actually don't live in a way in a democracy at all. We live in a mixed constitution. We have a monarch. We have a hereditary monarch. Every bill that goes through first the Commons, then the Lords, has to be signed off. I don't know if any of you watched the play, which was before Charles became king, but it anticipated a situation in which he was presented with a bill which he refused to sign. And so that's just a point of view.
Okay. I mean, I think in theory you can have other systems that are democratic. But I think the reason why, and actually you're absolutely right that the word liberal being appended to that is quite recent and is, I think, a product of certain things that are fundamental to liberal democracy being threatened in a way that certainly we in the UK haven't been used to. And I think, the courts and the law is a very good example here where, I've been writing about this subject and also about migration and refugees, which obviously heavily involves the law for nearly 20 years. But it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that the law has become a kind of central thing in what I report on. So I wrote a lot about the previous government's Rwanda deportation deal. And something I noticed with that and with all the other battles that were happening was, well, why are these political battles increasingly being fought out through the courts? That's because there is a threat, I think, because we've had governments that have sort of said we want to reduce the independence of those courts and therefore we need to defend that independence. But it's also not a good sign if that's being used as a substitute for politics, And so what I mean by all of that is that we shouldn't regard liberal democracy as the only or the perfect system. And I think the two things that it has provided an answer to, but not a full and sufficient answer. One is to do with inequality, as we've discussed. The other one, which we haven't discussed at all, is the issue of nationalism. That democracy also involves it presents the individual and the rights of the individual and individual political expression, but there has to be a sense of, as Paul put it, the people, and that we're, still in this confused space between a situation where the people could either be an ethnic group or some kind of quite homogenous national cultural group, or a diverse multi-ethnic group. And liberal democracy, for all its faults, was an attempt to create a situation in which diversity and difference can be protected and it can still be democratic. And so, for that reason, I think certainly the challenges to liberal democracy that present themselves as democratic at the moment, i.e. the bits I was talking about earlier coming from the populist right, I would say that they're not democratic because there about removing those kind of protections.
Clair?
So I think you can. I think the other kind of question, if you like, which maybe is a different day or different festival, is on the future of liberalism, because that is a related question to democracy, but it's not the only, this is the only sort of topic on it, because you've got a variety of kind of threats to liberalism from all different sides, actually. The post-liberals, the authoritarians, and the reformists, if you like, which I'll put as a new category to put myself in, is of people who kind of want the promise that it gives in terms of greater equality for women and so on and so forth. But the downsides of the lack of community and the lack of kind of citizen say, that has sort of led to this gap, if you like. So I don't think we should, chuck out the really important parts of the ideals of democracy. I actually love the idea of reconnecting with the original sense of democracy. I think methods like sortition could go very well with the idea of citizens' juries, which actually is that tech firms are developing in real-time product models. How could they be developed in a way that actually you could have representatives of citizens participating in that in a way to make all of this enormous potential sort of people-friendly and society-friendly and build community. So I think you could have sort of a post-liberal version, but I don't like the look of the post-liberal version we might be getting, because it's not my sort of communitarian fantasy of the way we would gather together. And I certainly agree about what Danny said in terms of elites have had to concede. But they've done that because people organised. Men didn't decide to give women the vote because they thought it would make their position better. It was because women organised. Working class people got the vote because trade unions and movements organised for those things. And I think we are in that moment now in a society that's really fragmented, that we can either just sort of sit back and wait for somebody else to, the tech firms to concede their power, or we can organise. But the questions I suppose I would put for Dex and others is, so how do we do that? Because it's not as if you've got loads of politicians who are like with ill intent trying to hoard power. They're grappling following with this stuff too. So I think the answer to me is not to ditch liberal democracy, is to almost refine the community routes to go with liberalism, to reform it, but also how do you put all these brilliant minds together in enough time to be able to be a force to compete with the concentrations of power? Because if we don't, we will not achieve the kind of human progress that we have the potential to. At the moment, I feel that all of these conversations are really disparate and disconnected because they're located in different companies, universities, and it's not come together. Unlike this, which I think is actually a rare example of these conversations coming together, it needs to be put together, I think, into a movement for change, which is about system control and power, and moves away from these concentrations, rather than it being sort of a disparate conversation, which actually doesn't really amount to anything. If women had sat around in whatever it was, 1910, and had these conversations in different places, then we would have never got the things we got. What they got was political action, and that's what we need now.
Why do we call it liberal? We have different reasons for putting that word ahead. I think it's being in favour of a democracy that doesn't go too far. Or there's a thing we don't touch when we talk about human rights. When we talk about human rights, we normally talk about the nice rights. The good ones. Every child should have this and so on. Towards the end of human rights, there's a right that I'm slightly less in favour of, which is the right to the quiet enjoyment of your property, which is why we have dirty rivers and why you can't simply nationalise the water system and why you can't do so many other things. And it comes part and parcel of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, you can be highly successful as a democratic country and allow people to hold on to their property. The Nordic countries are the exemplar of this. They have very high wealth inequalities, low income inequalities, and a quiet deal that the majority are allowed to gently get their way, good schools, good health service, and so on. But it's the extreme of what can be achieved. And I think the word liberal is partly code for this much power for the people, but not beyond. And again, this is ancient. if you go, I don't want to upset anybody here, but if you go through the 10 Commandments, at the beginning are the kind of nice ones, don't kill and so on, love your neighbour and all those. Right at the end, although there are different versions of Commandments 9 and 10, but the not covering your neighbour's wife, their slave, their donkey and their ass, and basically the right of property for men. It's always a small print at the end of the rights. And it's there in the 10 Commandments at the very end, and it's there in, our human rights law. And it is the tricky part of liberal democracy, is this much but no further. And at a time of the most acute inequalities of wealth, to say that inequality of wealth is something that you can't touch, I think that is likely to lead. And ironically, when Nigel Farage says he wants to take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which I don't believe we should, but if we were to do it, of course, the right for the enjoyment of their property of the people who own the office in Mayfair, who let him use it, would actually go. But I think he thinks he'll be okay. Yeah.
You and I don't have words later. I'd love to open this up to questions from the floor, but Dex, would you mind coming up and joining us to give people a little bit more chance to cross-examine you? Do we have? We have roving mics, and we have a hand up. Gentleman at the back. Perfect.
Thank you. This is really fascinating so far. I'd like to go back to Dex's slide of Nepal. Given that the House of Parliament are literally a tinderbox, do you think that Gen Z should put a match to them figurative literally?
We heard that stat about the number of people who are up for a dictatorship. The numbers get even worse when you look at the views for young people coming from the least well-resourced backgrounds. So actually, when you look at folks who come from more working-class backgrounds, there's a significantly higher percentage of people who are actually in favour of junking democracy in its various forms and having something that's much more autocratic. Actually, there's a large part of the world which lives under what some researchers refer to as electoral autocracies today. And actually, I disagree on the numbers. The numbers can be very seductive because they show that when it comes to the percentage of nations, it's relatively flat in terms of how many lived in democracies in the year 2000 versus now. Actually, overwhelmingly more people live under systems that are now rated as not fully free or not free at all. And partly that is, of course, due to the massive population growth in certain countries which are highly illiberal. So Freedom House, for example, said that in the year 2000, about 40% of the world's population lived in nations that were free, and now it's about 20%. And there's a much larger set of people who now live in the not fully free category. But certainly in large parts of the world, people have become quite used to living in systems which have the trappings of democracy on the surface, but do not resemble, of course, liberal democracy, or systems that probably most people in this room would feel pretty comfortable with.
Can I ask for a little clarification on that? Because the stats you mentioned about young people sort of falling out of love with democracy, do you have a breakdown on, for example, gender? Because what I was wondering is how much of that is coming out from this sort of toxic manosphere culture that is prevalent online, and how much of that statistic is sort of concentrated around that culture, or is this something that is cutting across gender and demographics for the younger generation more generally?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I haven't looked at those numbers for the UK, but certainly I'd be very interested in looking at those, and I'm not sure it would necessarily produce exactly the numbers to confirm that thesis. Because, for example, in the United States, when Donald Trump was elected for the first time, he received the majority of votes in this demographic from white, college-educated women. People are often shocked by that. They think, oh, actually, with all of his views and terrible record when it comes to women, how could possibly a plurality of college-educated white women have voted for him? Well, they did. So you actually get all sorts of different reactions which you might not necessarily fully expect. I mean, think of the massive numbers of folks coming from ethnic minority backgrounds who voted for Donald Trump as well. And then in many cases, it was those communities which absolutely got smashed by Trump when he came into office, those policies. So there's obviously a deeply troubling problem with the manaverse and the way we've had a whole generation of young men who've been radicalised through social media. But actually, we're in a mode now where there's all sorts of terrible sentiments and deeply illiberal values which have become quite popular with lots of people, including people you wouldn't expect at all.
Incidentally, that's me asking that question because I was interested in it's not my term. It's a good example of an abuse of power, so we can learn about democracy there. Let's have another question from the floor. I think there's a lady right at the front here. Bear with. It's coming.
Thank you for a very interesting event. I'd like to ask individual members of the panel what would make them decide to become a politician in the UK or not?
I'll do it. So I've always lazily decided not. It'll be dead easy to be a ward councillor. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I should confess, I still am amazingly. It would be so easy to become a councillor because they can't get enough people to stand. And if you can claim you went to school locally in the area, but it's a really, really hard job, right? Let alone the arrogance. My home city has never had, since 1370, an MP was born in it. But I haven't gone for that. What would make me feel I needed to would be PR. Because under PR, you need a lot more people standing, actually, than normal, really standing with a chance. And in quite a lot of European countries, it is normal if you're an academic to also stand for a political party and occasionally go into politics and occasionally go back to a university. We don't have that here at all. But it would be PR simply because there would need to be so many people. Your main parties would split. I'd be on the left of Labour, whatever it was called. But having argued for decades for a fair voting system, to then say, can't be bothered.
That's...
I am thinking of running for office, so this is a live problem for me. What I'm agonising over is there's an opportunity cost with running. I may be a really bad politician because I'm extremely blunt. I will absolutely refuse to use any of those stupid sound bites from politicians and sticking to any of their established conventions on things. I'm also an internationalist, and I refuse to indulge the weird indulgence of a whole bunch of politicians in trying to suck up to a strain of nationalism that is infecting our society. My dad was a refugee. How likely is it you think I'm going to be calling for stopping the boats? We've got a damn problem, which is there's millions of refugees. This country built international law. The entire promise of this nation, as one of the few fully free nations in the world, is that we can save those people. And maybe the way we're doing it right now is not the correct way or the right way economically, but there's a different path than simply just being deeply callous as a society. I'm going to say all of that. Am I electable? I have no earthly clue. So we'll see. I am trying to figure this one out at the moment. So
what is your one vote?
Excellent.
Claire, you sort of did go into politics, right? It'd be really interesting to hear your take on this.
Yeah, so my initial take was no thanks. But that's a personal one, I think. I think I saw what politicians go through, and I know asking for sympathy for politicians here is dark, but my human reaction of the attempts I saw, having security to be followed by security all the time, there was arson next to his house, those sorts of things. And also I got a bit of flack online, I absolutely hated it. I was just a staffer that was just trying to, with good intention. So the idea of putting myself further into the line of fire of that, I just think, would really put me off. That's my honest sort of human reaction to it. I also think we've got a bit of the danger generally that people think Dex not as I, but people think that if only they can come in with their solutions and answers and incredible talent, and they find that all of the system around them, funnily enough, takes all of that and say, actually, Dex, you can't say that. If you say that, this is going to happen, and you guys don't care, and you're like, well, you've lost the wit. Or you say, okay, we'll have a quick look at it. Okay, that's fine. Then you make those compromises, and there are hundreds and hundreds of really good people who've ended up in that position. And then before you know it, you're locked into something where you have less freedom than you do now. So I think ultimately, and this is really pertinent in the UK because we could be facing a change, I would love to believe that a person is the problem, but I just don't think it's as simple as that. I think we have to have a broader answer, which is about how we change some of those systems and how we have a more honest conversation in the country about the sorts of things we need to confront some of this. Because actually, once people have wealth and power, they do not want to give it away. It's really easy for us to think about this as being like the really rich 1% or these sort of nameless sort of tech bros. What if we think about it as our savings and investments? What about if we think about the things that we own, the power we have, the voice we have? We don't want to give that away. And actually, young people now, no wonder they're annoyed because there is more wealth being concentrated in generations that have earned it over many years, and we are not willing to give that up. So I think unless we are also prepared to say, you know what, I come to the table with my wealth and power and aware of that, and willing to share in that conversation, then we can't even start to have a conversation that young people think that they've got any purchase on whatsoever.
I'm far, far too old. And I'm almost as old as the Tangerine Tyrant himself. But some of my best friends are actually politicians. One of them an MP. And another one is standing in the Makerfield by-election. His name is Count Binface. Now, I hope you all read his manifesto for his last standing, which was actually against another kind of, not tangerine, but sort of straw-haired classes. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, but in antiquity, just to put a historical perspective, there were no political parties. So every professional politician, of which there were, stood for election as him, certain credits, all men, and therefore on whatever he believed, what he thought the right issues were. And his career was as good as his last speech. And the friends he had, people who voted for him, being a democratic politician in antiquity was you were under constant threat, but you were constantly alert to changes. And so there was no such thing as a programme that you were obliged to stand by. There were no sound bites provided for you by a party apparatus. In all those ways, I do believe many more of our MPs should, in the future, in the kind of PR regime that has been advocated here, they should be independents. And in a way, I would almost go so far as to say every MP or representative should be an independent. But then you ask, okay, well, what are you going to hold them accountable for or to? And then I do come back. I mean, you all may have different views on whether or not there should be parties at all, or if there are, how they should be managed differently or whatever. The other thing I'd say is that in the ancient world, no social media, only mass media. What we're doing today is the only way you could communicate in the ancient world. So no anonymous bile, no manosphere, no lies perpetrated by algorithms. You know, there are all sorts of things which stop me because of the hate that is poured out on our representatives. All those would stop me wanting to be a representative of you. But also I think the very existence of social media, invented by the tech bros in order to democratise information, has sadly very often operated in the exact opposite direction.
Ben?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, and I think as a general rule, journalists shouldn't move between journalism and national politics. I don't think journalists should become MPs, and I think that's because our democracy is so heavily mediated, because it has to be, because 80 million people can't all know one another. You have to do it through forms of mass communication. The blurring of the lines between journalism and politics is a real problem, and there's been a lot of it in the last decade or so. And let's all remember what happened last time a former journalist became Prime Minister. But I would also say there's more than one way to be political, and I think something that I would stress, and actually it's a point Clair made as well, is that, I mean, this is the problem with representative politics, that people tend to see only the representative bit as the politics, and so their only way of being political has been voting for those representatives. And I think a huge problem we've had is, I mean, something that suits people in power very well and has been encouraged by people in power, that they're best left to get on with it, and that it's not really for us to kind of get up their noses and make our own views heard. So I always feel like I should do more of the latter, and I think it's in many ways better to do that than think about politics as only should we or should we not stand as MPs.
Let's have another question. I think there was a hand up there and a hand up there, so I'll take both of those questions in one go and then ask you to answer those.
It seems to me there's a large gap between what Dex started us off with and what the panel talked about. It hasn't been bridged, I think, partly because nobody's talked about, or more than just a mention, economic democracy. Why many people are frightened of AI, and some even think it's evil, or is going to destroy the human race, is because it's being produced at breakneck speed for profit. So we don't feel secure about safeguards of different kinds. And that sort of thing is going to be more and more of a problem as we get these huge companies operated by small numbers of people with vast amounts of wealth. And I think it is the economic democracy that really needs to be developed. And it's this that's making AI such a threat in many people's eyes.
And the gentleman, I'm going to take three because I've spotted a gentleman here. There's one behind you, and I'll get you as well.
Mine links into that economic democracy. It's about how we can distribute.
Don't worry, so we'll get you to.
It's about how, like you said, how do we do that? How do we exert any sort of influence really over economic factors that mostly drive our world, and the reason that lots of people are very angry they can't provide for their families, they don't have enough. This may not be it's not a liberal view necessarily, but it is about reclaiming power, because we are the ones who give people power democratically and economically. We give them our wages through rent and mortgages. Can we exert influence over wealth inequality and also what wealth is invested into if we simply stop paying for things that we need to exist? So stop paying for homes that we live in that are owned by someone else, and they pay for it, but we can never pay for these things ourselves. So there is that sense of we're paying to exist, and if we stopped paying to exist, would we regain power politically and economically?
That's an interesting point. And the gentleman has a fabulous shirt at the back.
I'd like to come back to Paul's comment about Greek democracy being direct, and it was through debate with each other that we came to conclusions and things happened. Does social media give us the opportunity for an equivalent modern agora where the debates took place for everybody, and what is the legal and other framework that we need to ensure that democratic form of social media can happen?
I'm going to ask you, panel, not necessarily to answer all of these questions. I'll just get a couple of comments from each of you, and then we'll take another group. Who fancies going first? Go on, David.
So I suppose in response to the first two questions about economic democracy and then questions of power and so on, I just want to throw something out there to think about here that I think is difficult and we haven't really addressed, and I have not got the answer to. But if by economic democracy, and I think actually it means much more than it, but if you mean simple kind of redistribution of wealth to make a society that's equal, and if we think back to what Dex was saying in his opening talk about kind of the huge challenges facing us, not least climate change, or climate crisis rather, democracy isn't necessarily the most efficient and quick-moving system to make responses to these things. So to redistribute wealth or to rapidly scale up the production of solar panels, for instance, it may seem like authoritarianism is a more efficient way to reach them. And so, where do we go from there is my question. I think this, and to me, the reason why keeping democracy part of the conversation is because long-term, the authoritarian solutions, appealing as they look in situations that seem like emergencies, are not more efficient and are not more, do not provide people with better lives. So, on my mind there, among other things, was China at the moment, the way that China has been able to take the lead with adapting to cleaner forms of technology. Well, that probably feels very efficient if you're one of the people that benefits from that. It probably does not feel very efficient or free or anything if you're a Uyghur living in the west of China, for instance. Also, over time, I think those systems, what happens when someone makes a bad decision and somewhere up in the hierarchy, things can collapse very rapidly. But I think that's the difficult aspect of democracy in whatever form, is that it also requires accepting this is actually going to be quite messy, people are going to argue, and things are going to take time to sort out. And I do think sometimes when we have these conversations about, the benefits of democracy and the need to defend it and so on, that's something we skate over.
Just to give a couple of sort of tangible examples of how might we be able to do some of this in practice. I listened to the mayor of the other Athens in Ohio, who was talking about kind of the challenge they have around climate change, which is really acute for them. They want to scale up really quickly their use of solar, but they were just planning just took ages because apparently you had to get legal permission to do this in your homes. So they basically use tech solutions to give people a 24-hour yes or no turnaround by applying online to do your solar panels. And so it's a small example, but I do think that the answer to some of these things aren't big silver bullet solutions. Some of it is just going to be really hard graft of locally, regionally, nationally. How do we bring tech into the everyday things that we might find difficult and give people the power to do rather than see it as a barrier that stops people? I also really like the idea of if we were to have sort of citizens' juries or more of these direct democracies, because to the point about social media, there have been various attempts to do kind of online convening of people, but I think on the whole, face-to-face sort of town hall style helps to depolarise in a way that some of the social media answers don't help us see sort of eye to eye, whereas the sort of in-person town hall styles that you could do through sortition might be ways to govern our way through some of these difficulties. So it's really just sort of a couple of examples that I think nobody is basically going to come down with a solution to all of this for us. I think it is going to have to be on a very sort of local level that we keep pushing this forward, and I think the breakthroughs will come. But I think at the moment it feels like we're living in the age before the light comes, and if we aren't part of doing that and we're sitting waiting for it, it's not going to come through anything other than us rapidly getting involved in some of these processes ourselves.
Dex?
I'll come back to your question. The economic democracy, or I'll just talk about it as inequality, is going to be staggering in an AI age. This technology and the kind of effects I talked about will be extraordinarily centralizing in terms of political and economic power. And we know that because it's already happening right now. Next week, SpaceX, where I used to work, is having an IPO, largest IPO in history, $1.75 trillion roughly. Elon Musk is likely to become the world's first trillionaire in about a week. His personal wealth will be equivalent to just over 3% of US GDP, or just over 25% of UK GDP. 12 billionaire men in the United States, all men, have as much wealth as 49% of humanity this year. That's before we get to AGI. And so any serious economic agenda for any nation that wants to hang on to democracy 10, 15, 20 years from now has to recognise that's now, and it's going to get much worse, and we're going to need a completely different economic model and set of institutions to stop an oligarchical class controlling the world, including all of our societies. And to do that, you're not going to be able to do it just as the UK. There is no ability of any single nation to restrain that power, because you're assembling a planetary corporate power now. 5 nations are going to rule the world, basically, 100 years from now. And so, actually, my solutions, I agree that you need the local, you need national, you need a whole bunch of solutions. There isn't one, clickbait-style quick fix to all our problems, one weird trick to save democracy. But the bit that I'm particularly interested in is, what do those international solutions look like? How do we team up as fast as possible with the other remaining 3 nations to stand against that agenda and come up with a much more powerful collective agenda that allows us, at least gives us, a more competitive fight against those corporate interests while there's still time. Very simply, if, for example, your scheme might involve at some point taxing the tiny number of billionaires and companies that will gain disproportionate shares of the AI future, then you're going to need a global taxation to do that, or they'll simply move across borders, which is what's happening now. And the other thing is, our existing international structures are so weak and inadequate. They were designed for the 1940s. You're probably going to need a whole new architecture globally to pull this off, which is where, again, this is where I get really unelectable. The European Union is one of the greatest achievements in history of democracy. We built a continental parliament. We built in a whole alliance and set of institutions to restrain a world war on this continent. Why is the European Union continental? Why isn't it global? Why is democracy a thing that we only care about when it reaches the southern shores of Europe? I think we should form something that's much more powerful, and we should invite all sorts of other democratic nations into that, and it becomes more like a world union. So let's see if that passes muster when I go up for parliamentary selection.
Well, if Australia can be in Eurovision, why can't it be in the EU? I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to invite Danny and then Paul to wrap this up.
I think, as you grew up in Kent, you should stand against Nigel Farage. A closer connection to his seat.
I'd take him on.
Yeah, excellent. I think you wrote a book in the 1970s, Richard, could have been later, where you had the obsession with steam engines and how the steam engines became faster and faster and faster. And most of us have got an idea about how a steam engine works, but we don't know about the evolution of the steam engines. We couldn't actually design them. But that was over a long period, and it was transformational for societies, what it allows us to do in factories. AI, you have to pretend you know what it is. Even if you work in an AI company, unless you're one of the dozen programmers, actually, at the core, my suspicion is that 98% of people in AI companies have to pretend they know what it's doing. For the sake of time. And if you put into ChatGPT, what does Danny Dorling know about AI, it'll tell you how unqualified I am to talk about this, which makes me very suspicious of AI. The question about not paying your rent and not paying the mortgage. When millions of people can't pay the mortgage, you're safe, because they can't evict you from your homes because a home goes damp in about 18 months. But if you don't pay a mortgage, they get your house and they make more money out of you than they would have ever made from your payments. And the same with rent. What you can do is not pay for Claude, not pay for ChatGPT, not sign up to the new levy, which is currently being rolled out. So that's one thing that's possible. The other thing I think that people are doing, in a way of a strike, but not deliberate, but is working, is not having children. And that's one reaction to current circumstances, to the cost of living, to being exploited, is this fall in people actually starting families and having children. It's not a mass movement, people don't get together and say, let's not have children. But it's a repercussion of the way that we are currently living and organising society, that we're seeing this dramatic fall. We're down to 1.4 children per couple. China's just dropped back to 1. India's at 1.9. There's only a few countries where it's higher. It's all cascading down. And then we sit in universities and wonder, why aren't we getting enough students from anywhere? Right? This, if you want an ultimate idea of what's going badly wrong, is the fact that most people don't feel they can start families at the point that their parents or grandparents could. But it's not a collective issue, but it is a kind of strike.
The polychromatic gentleman up there, he suggested that maybe social media, electronic, digital, would be an equivalent to the ancient way of doing things. Well, I noticed no one's used the dread word referendum. And of course, every ancient democratic mass meeting, citizen decision was a referendum. And it might be merely operational, it might be actually constitutional. Who is entitled to take decisions? Now, in principle, thanks to the tech bros, let's say the government were to announce next week, give us 5 working days, we will hold a referendum on whether or not we think Trident is more important than the NHS. Now, you may have noticed you're never asked a question of that absolutely fundamental, basic nature, and there are 2 reasons. One is government, and it doesn't wish us actually to govern, and that may be a rational decision. But on the other hand, it has the downside that you and I typically are disqualified to understand what it is to make such a decision, even though actually it's absolutely crucial. And then, I suppose, the use of media, which you've alluded to, it's possible to use it in other ways than the bad ones. And I have a former student, he heads up the New Citizenship Project. And if I could borrow a phrase from the dreaded Tony Blair, education, education, education about the nature of politics, of being a citizen, from, I would say, about the age of 14, 15. I am part of Robert Peston's Speakers for Schools programme. Oxbridge academics talk to state schools, typically in my local area, and they're typically either GCSE or A-level students. And I always ask them 2 questions. One, should prisoners be allowed to retain the vote? Most European countries allow them, we don't. Secondly, should 16-year-olds be given the vote in national elections in the UK? Yes. They all think that's great. But actually, it's an incredibly dangerous thing to have the vote. And so we go back to individual liberal democracy. It's precious. It's taken us 300 years to get where we are. Please fight to retain it. Thank you.